The Las Vegas Raiders will have a ton of interesting decisions to make this offseason, and today I want to talk about 5 free agents that the Raiders should absolutely be targeting. These are guys that I think could benefit the Las Vegas Raiders, and I want to kind of talk through some of these different guys. Obviously, we're not going to sign all 5 of them, truth be told. We'll probably bring in one free agent. It'll be a guy that will end up paying, $10 to $12 million plus minus 10, right? Really depending on the type of player this is. Last year, if you guys remember, the Raiders signed Wilkins, and it made us a lot better as a defensive line. Now, obviously, our defensive line ended up getting banged up, so we didn't actually see it really come together. But I think this season, the Las Vegas Raiders, if they're able to just add 1 or 2 key pieces, they're able to figure out that quarterback position, I think the Raiders should have a lot of success. Now, I do want to state this right away before we get into this list. We will not be having any quarterbacks on this list. As you guys know, there's guys out there that are free agents, Sam Darnold, Jameis Winston. There's some guys that'll be released, Aaron Rodgers. Maybe there's some guys that get traded, potentially Matthew Stafford. We will not be talking about any of the quarterbacks, right? Because the Raiders are going to have to figure out that plan, and that's always a hard position to really predict. But let's get into it, man. I want to talk about what are some of the things that the Raiders have to do this offseason, right? To really get better, to get to that point where they can actually compete for a Super Bowl. I think one of the things the Raiders can absolutely do is target a right tackle. And this one's one of those positions where you look at the Raiders' current roster, and they definitely have a guy that has some upside at right tackle. Right, DJ Glaze could be the real deal for the Raiders. I don't think he's proven it yet, right? I don't think DJ Glaze has shown me enough where I'm saying this guy's the future, but he also hasn't shown me that he's not the future. Right? And I think for the Las Vegas Raiders, you could definitely just continue to go forward with DJ Glaze and say this guy's your starting right tackle as you kind of go forward. But you also got to realize DJ Glaze was a 3rd round pick, right? He was not a top 10 pick. He's not a top 20 pick. His leash is not as long as someone that was potentially the 10th, 11th overall pick. Right? DJ Glaze being a 3rd round pick means that's generally guys that are like a long-term development, backup type players. And I think if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, tackles don't come around that often. Guys like Cam Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars, most recently the Minnesota Vikings, these are guys and positions that don't come available that often. And don't get me wrong, Cam Robinson by no means is like a top 10 tackle. But Robinson's a solid option for the Raiders. If you want to be able to bring in a guy that is 6'6", he's long, he's experienced, he's still kind of entering that prime. He'll probably get a little bit better as we kind of go forward, but he's a guy that I think for the Raiders, the Vikings lost their starting tackle at some point, and they have 2 starting tackles. But because they lost that tackle, they went ahead and made this trade for Cam Robinson. And of course, the Jags didn't have the money budgeted for Cam Robinson, so they knew they were going to lose him anyway, so they went ahead and traded him early. But the Vikings don't have the money to bring him back, and I think for the Raiders, you're not paying this guy like $20 million. To me, Cam Robinson's probably going to get somewhere between 12 to 15 million, and I think for the Raiders, that could be a potential bargain where Cam Robinson, you bring him in, you put him in at right tackle, and then with a guy like DJ Glaze, you can easily jump him to the inside. And I think for the Raiders, that's a win-win situation. Now again, I'm not out on DJ Glaze. I think he showed some upside last year, but we do have to realize your offensive tackles matter way more than any other position when it comes to protecting your quarterbacks. So to me, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you really have to think about if you're going to just go into this season with DJ Glaze, understanding that if DJ Glaze is not a good tackle, keep in mind, Chip Kelly's running a completely different scheme than some of what we've had in the past. Will 5-man protect a lot more this season? If you go in with DJ Glaze and he's not a good tackle, you're not going to be able to make that change mid-season, right? So it's something that John Spytek's going to have to really think about as we kind of approach the draft, as we approach the free agency period. How do you handle that offensive line? How do you revamp it, right? Who's going to be those anchors on the offensive tackle positions? Cam Robinson's definitely a guy I'm considering if I'm the Las Vegas Raiders. Another thing that I think the Raiders have to consider, and I think this is one of those things where you look at the strength of a team, right? And you look at the Las Vegas Raiders as an example of this. You look at what the Raiders do really, really well right now, and one of the things that we do really well is we get after the quarterback. Even though we were banged up this past season, our team still did a pretty good job getting after the quarterback. Of course, Rob Leonard's a part of that, but so is the fact that we have some talented players back there. So is the fact that we're able to sign guys or potentially bring in guys that maybe weren't as good elsewhere, and they end up having success with the Las Vegas Raiders. To me, one of the things the Raiders can do going into next season is just kind of, improve that defensive line, maybe add a little bit of depth, or maybe even add arguably a top 10 defensive tackle in Osa Odigizua, who's currently the starting defensive tackle of the Cowboys. This guy last year had the third most pressures. He had 7 sacks, 14 quarterback hits. He had 60 total pressures, which was third behind Chris Jones and Zach Allen. Osa Odigizua would be a really, really interesting signing because the Raiders already signed Christian Wilkins. We have Maxx Crosby under contract. And we have Adam Butler and Malcolm Koonce as pending free agents. So the Raiders do have the flexibility that you can, instead of paying a guy like Koonce, go and bring in a guy like Osa Odigizua. Remember, Malcolm Koonce is not going to cost $5 million. Like, this is not Madden. This is the real world where guys with that type of pass rush, they're going to get north of $15 million. And if you're the Las Vegas Raiders ownership, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders general manager, head coach, whatever it is, would you rather go in with a defensive end that's a top 10-ish to 15 pass rusher, or would you rather go in with the top 10 to 15 defensive tackle that's a pass rusher, right? You're essentially swapping out Osa Odigizua for Malcolm Koonce. Now, of course, I have a soft spot in my heart for Malcolm Koonce, so I would probably not do that, but I think Osa is still a very, very intriguing player. And again, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you take that strength, right? You take that defensive line and you really take it to that next step, right? You have Maxx Crosby, who can beat anybody in a one-on-one situation. You have Christian Wilkins, who can beat anybody in a true one-on-one situation. And then you can put Osa Odigizua next to Christian Wilkins, who can also beat anyone in a one-on-one. And you could still try to bring back Adam Butler for depth. And that gives you a really, really, really stacked rotation. And, of course, if you let Malcolm Koonce walk, you might have to draft the defensive end. Maybe bring back Clavon Chase on if it's cheap enough. Or maybe you even take it to a whole nother level and say, let's get another defensive end. Maybe it's Abdul Carter. Maybe it's James Pierce Jr. Maybe it's Mikael Williams. Right? There's so many really, really good pass rushers in this class. And I feel like for the Raiders, even in the second round, you can get a starting caliber pass rusher. Right? Jalen Walker of Georgia's a starting caliber guy. You got guys like Mike Green, who might actually be available in the second round. So the Raiders can really do a whole lot in this draft. And you can add Osa and just really take that defensive line to the next level. To me, there's no offensive line that would be able to block that type of unit. And even just this past season, if we had Butler healthy, if we had Koonce healthy and Wilkins and Maxx, if we had those 4 guys healthy, I think the Raiders' defensive line would have been unblockable regardless, right? So we'll see what ends up kind of happening as we go forward. But let's get into another guy that I think the Raiders should really consider. And this is more player-specific. Former Raider Amari Cooper is a pending free agent. He was traded from the Cleveland Browns recently to the Buffalo Bills. He didn't have a lot of success this past season. I'm not 100% sure if it had to do with, the Browns had a terrible quarterback situation, right, where it really didn't work out for them. That Watson and I think Jameis Winston was the other quarterback. It was kind of back and forth for them at the quarterback position. Then you look at a team where he got traded to, like the Buffalo Bills, really didn't have a lot of success with them either. Truth be told, this was the worst season Amari Cooper had. But I will say this, maybe there was also an injury that kind of happened that we don't really know, right? Because just last year, statistically, Amari Cooper had 1,250 yards and 5 touchdowns. The year before that, he had 1,160 yards and 9 touchdowns, right? So Amari Cooper has been a productive wide receiver, and I think he would fit really, really well with the Las Vegas Raiders. Amari Cooper is not necessarily known as a guy that's a true X wide receiver, but I think the Raiders are in a unique situation where we have Brock Bowers, who, although, again, he's not an X wide receiver, Brock Bowers is going to demand double teams. He's the guy that the Raiders can really rely on and look to. And Amari Cooper would be a great number 2 option to Brock Bowers. Even though Amari Cooper's 30 years old, I think he would still be a really, really good wide receiver for the Raiders, and he would fit what they're kind of looking to do, right? And, of course, he gets to kind of come home to the team that ultimately had drafted him. And I think for Amari Cooper, who's 30 years old, he still has 2 to 3 good years left. And, again, he's a good route runner. He has the ability to really create that separation. And, of course, we got to figure out the quarterback position, but we have a plan, right? Like, just because it's not public doesn't mean John Spytek and Pete Carroll don't have a plan, right? So as we kind of go forward, we're going to figure out, maybe it's Aaron Rodgers, Maybe it's Matthew Stafford. Maybe it's Cam Ward or Shador Sanders or Jackson Dart. I think being able to add a guy like Amari Cooper really gives you like that wide receiver to get paired with Brock Bowers. That also gives you Jacoby and Michael Mayer kind of paired up as well. So I think for the Raiders, Amari Cooper could be a very, very solid target. Now, do keep in mind, a lot of people might say, hey, why go for Amari Cooper when you can go out there and get T. Higgins? T. Higgins is not realistic, right? T. Higgins is not coming to the Raiders. The Bengals have already made it known that they plan to franchise tag T. Higgins. And if they can't franchise him, they'll obviously look to, if they don't, it'll be because they ultimately sign him to a long-term contract. But T. Higgins is not going to be a free agent. And I know everyone's going to say, why Amari? Go out there and get T. Higgins. There's not a lot of wide receivers that are truly available out there, right? A lot of these guys are going to end up back with the same team that they're with, the previous season. I think Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, maybe DeAndre Hopkins are like the true 3 wide receivers that really will be available. I think a lot of the other guys are going to end up back with the teams that ultimately they were with last season, T. Higgins being one of them. I think Amari Cooper would be a really, really interesting player for the Raiders. Another guy that I think could be very, very interesting. It's an offensive lineman. Now, keep in mind, I already talked a little bit about Cam Robinson, the right tackle. Another offensive lineman that I would heavily consider if I'm the Raiders is going to be Mekhi Becton, who most recently played with the Philadelphia Eagles. Everybody kind of knows who Becton is at this point, right? Everybody knows the season he ultimately had as well. Mekhi Becton is not the perfect player, right? He has losing reps. He gets beat with speed. It happens all the time. But the guy did show that he's an elite caliber guard, or he's a Pro Bowl caliber guard. And the fact this guy is still only 25 years old, for the Raiders, you can realistically get a guy like Becton for a lot cheaper than you could probably get a guy like Trey Smith. Right, Trey Smith has multiple years of success. Trey Smith's going to get $18 to $22 million, right? Somewhere in that range. Mekhi Becton could probably be had for between 10 to 14 million. I think he gets something similar to what Damian Lewis got last year with the Carolina Panthers, right? I think it was like 12 or 13 million, which is what he got. I think Becton kind of falls within that same range, especially since he hasn't been healthy long term. And I think for the Raiders, again, if DJ Glazer's your guy at right tackle, you bring in Mekhi Becton and you put him at right guard, that at least makes it a little bit easier for the Raiders in terms of revamping their offensive line. I've said this again, and I'll say it again. The Raiders need 2 new guards. The guards we have right now are not the starting caliber guards. It's just not. It just doesn't look good right now, right? Based off of what the tape shows, based off of what we did this past season. You have 2 types of offensive linemen. You have guys that are people movers, right? They make contact with the defensive lineman, and as soon as they hit them, they go left 5 yards. Or you got guys that are people holders, right? You got guys like Dylan Park. You got guys like Jordan Meredith, right? These guys make contact with people, and there's no movement one way or the other. They just kind of stand still where they make contact. Right, the thing with those offensive linemen is they're good to fill in. They're good. You bring them in. They have a little bit of success. They fill in. Cool, great backups to have. Maybe they play center and guard, both guards. But those guys are not long-term going to be able to allow an offensive line to have that type of success that you need to have. Right, you need guys that can move people out of gaps, that can create lanes for running backs. Right now, the Raiders have no one at the guard position that can move someone. And of course, I'm considering Jackson Powers-Johnson our starting center going forward. The Raiders got to get 2 new guards, in my opinion. And you bring in Mekhi Becton, that's one of the 2 guys, right? Maybe you draft the guy with the 6th overall pick for right tackle, and you bring in Mekhi Becton. That fixes the entire offensive line. DJ Glaze slides to one guard position, Mekhi Becton to the other. And then, of course, at the right tackle position, you have whoever you decide to draft. To me, the Raiders have a ton of options, right? And we have a lot of cap space. We have a lot of flexibility. John Spytek is not tied to Adam Butler or Malcolm Koonce or Trayvon Merrick, so he can make whatever change it is that he wants to ultimately make. And then finally, we'll talk about a running back. I want to talk about the position, the running back position specifically. There's one guy that I like that's a free agent. He grew up near Oakland, Najee Harris. I think he was born in Martinez, went to school in, I believe it was Pittsburgh or it could have been Antioch. Najee Harris from that area. To me, Najee Harris is one of those guys where I think his best football is in front of him. And I think for the Raiders, if you can bring in Najee Harris for like $6 to $12 million, somewhere in between there. Maybe not 12, maybe a little bit less than that. But if you can bring him in for that, somewhere in that range. He's a guy that I would really, really consider if I'm the Raiders. Najee Harris is 6'1", 245 pounds. He's not the type of running back that at 26 is going to break down. After 4 years, he's going to break down. That's not Najee Harris. Najee Harris is going to have the most success in his career, in my opinion, over the next 2 to 3 years, right? It's going to be his best years. And I think for the Raiders, if you want to get a running back like Najee Harris, who, he's gotten better and better and better. Pittsburgh's situation hasn't been perfect when it comes to the run game, right? They've really started to revamp that O-line a couple years back. It's still not a very good offensive line. They have some young guys that really haven't developed. But Najee Harris has shown that he could be a good running back. And I think with the Raiders, if you really revamp that O-line, you bring in a guy like Najee Harris, you can actually have a little bit of success. Now, again, I'm going to step back and say this. I still think the Raiders should draft 2 running backs. I think it's the best strategy, especially with this draft class. You can get a second or third round running back, and then you can get another guy in the 4th or 5th round. 2 running backs in this class. This class is the best running back class we've seen in years. There's probably 10 to 12 running backs that'll have an impact in the NFL, right? And I think for the Raiders, drafting a running back obviously is going to make the most sense. But even bringing in a free agent running back, whether it's Najee Harris, there's 2 other guys that I would consider, Aaron Jones, Nick Chubb. Both running backs have had success. Nick Chubb's returning from injury. He is 29. I'd hesitate with that a little bit, but he's proven in the past that he was a good running back. Maybe you squeeze 1 or 2 years out of him, similar to what the Vikings did with Aaron Jones last year. They bring him in. It's just a 1-year contract. Maybe the Raiders do something similar with Jones or Chubb, where it's just like a 1 or 2 year contract. It's a low-end contract, right? It's kind of beneficial for the Raiders. I think that could make sense as well, right? In my opinion, last year the Raiders have no running backs that I would keep going into this year. I wouldn't keep Zamir White. I wouldn't keep Alexander Madison. I wouldn't keep Amir Abdullah. And specifically, I wouldn't keep them as your main running backs, right? Abdullah's an okay third down running back if you want to keep him on the roster. Zamir White, I don't know. Maybe he plays fullback or a different position. But those are not guys that I would give a bunch of carries to, right? To me, the Raiders should draft 2 rookie running backs in the top 3 or 4 rounds this upcoming draft, and they're probably going to be the 2 best running backs on the roster. So to me, the Raiders got to get better at that running back position. And remember, your best playmakers don't just have to be tight ends or wide receivers. Your best playmaker could be a running back. As long as it's a rookie contract or as long as you have a good offensive line that could support that running back position, you can have success. Moving off of Josh Jacobs was not the bad part of that strategy. It was not replacing him with another guy. It was not revamping that offensive line. That was the issue for the Raiders, right? So we'll see what ends up happening as we kind of go forward. Those are some of the guys that I would definitely target. Obviously, it doesn't have to be those guys, but you guys understand from a positional perspective. Right tackle could make sense. Defensive tackle could make sense. Maybe a little bit less. But receiver definitely makes sense. Guard makes sense. Running backs make sense, right? Those are the positions that I think, as long as the Raiders get better at those positions and they figure out that quarterback position, the team should be good. We have some solid players on this team, right? No matter what anybody says, there's not a lot of tight ends in the NFL better than Brock Bowers. There's not a lot of centers better than Jackson Powers-Johnson. There's not a lot of wide receivers, wide receiver 2s or tight end 2s. Better than Michael Mayer and Jacoby Myers, right? And again, I know those aren't like guys that are going to be like difference makers, but they're like number 2 guys, right? Jacoby Myers is a wide receiver 2, right? Not a lot of guys better than him. Michael Mayer is a second tight end. Not a lot of guys better than him, right? That doesn't include Christian and Maxx that are top 10 guys. Malcolm, Koonce, and Butler could be top 10 to 15 guys, specifically in pass rushing. That doesn't include the fact that we have an elite defensive coach and Patrick Graham, a guy that runs a phenomenal scheme, right? So the Raiders are going to have success. They got to just get 1 or 2, 1 or 2 of these positions fixed, be a free agency, get some guys to the draft, get that quarterback right. We'll see what ends up happening. Let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.